The ocean has always been a place where human understanding breaks down, where the rules of land-based logic seem to dissolve into mist and saltwater spray, where distance and isolation create conditions that allow mysteries to flourish, allowed events to occur without witnesses, allowed crimes to be committed and hidden by the vastness of water and sky. The sea is an environment that operates according to rules that are fundamentally different from the world of land. On land, human activity typically leaves traces. Crimes leave evidence. Accidents leave debris. Deaths leave bodies. The landscape retains the marks of human action. The physical world bears witness to what has transpired. But the sea is different. The sea erases. The sea destroys. The sea obliterates evidence. A body can sink into depths where it will never be found. A boat can be broken apart and scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. An object can be swallowed by waves and never recovered. The sea is a place where human action can occur without leaving permanent physical evidence. The sea is a place where mystery can persist indefinitely. In the history of maritime mystery, and there is a long and detailed history of maritime mystery, extending back to the earliest days of human sea travel, certain cases stand out, not because they are unique in their violence or their tragedy, but because they represent a particular kind of absence. The absence of explanation, the absence of bodies, the absence of any clear evidence that definitively tells us what has happened. The case of the Pacific Star is one such case. It is a case about 8 men. It is a case about a fishing vessel in the waters off New Zealand in November 1967. It is a case about the sea and the secrets that the sea keeps. It is a case that, nearly 60 years later, remains unsolved and largely forgotten, except by those families who were directly affected by the disappearance. It is a case that illustrates the way that the sea can swallow human lives and leave no trace behind. The Pacific Star was a fishing vessel, approximately 65 meters in length, with a crew capacity of 10 people, though she was typically operated with a crew of 8 when engaged in commercial fishing operations. She was registered in New Zealand and had been operated by various fishing companies over her lifetime. In November 1967, she was owned by a fishing company based in Tauranga and was under the command of Captain James Mackenzie. The Pacific Star was not a modern vessel even by 1967 standards. She had been constructed in the 1950s and showed signs of her age and the wear that came from constant operation in the demanding environment of commercial fishing. But she was a seaworthy vessel. She had been maintained according to maritime standards. She had passed all required inspections. She was considered fit for service and capable of safely conducting fishing operations in the waters off New Zealand. The 8 crew members who sailed on the Pacific Star in November 1967 were experienced fishermen. Most of them had worked the waters of the Bay of Plenty for years. Some had worked together on the same vessel for extended periods. They knew the patterns of the fish. They knew the weather patterns that characterized the region. They knew what to expect from the sea. They knew the risks of commercial fishing and had accepted those risks as part of their work. Captain James Mackenzie was 54 years old when he took command of the Pacific Star for what would be his final voyage. Mackenzie had been at sea for 34 years. He had started his maritime career as a deckhand on a merchant vessel at the age of 20. He had worked his way up through the ranks of the merchant marine, acquiring the skills and knowledge necessary to eventually obtain his captain's license. Mackenzie had married in 1937, at the age of 24. His wife, Margaret, was a woman from a fishing family in Tauranga. They had married despite Margaret's family's concerns about her marrying a man whose profession would keep him away from home for extended periods. But Margaret had accepted the nature of her husband's work. Over 30 years of marriage, Margaret had learned to manage the household, raise their 4 children, and maintain the farm they had purchased on the outskirts of Tauranga, all while her husband was away at sea for weeks or months at a time. By 1967, Mackenzie was a respected captain. He was known throughout the fishing industry for his competence and his reliability. He was trusted with expensive equipment and valuable cargo. He was the kind of captain who ran a tight ship, but was fair to his crew. He was known for treating his crew members with respect and for being concerned about their safety and welfare. Mackenzie had 7 grandchildren in 1967. He doted on them. He brought them gifts when he returned from voyages. He told them stories about his adventures at sea. He was looking forward to eventually retiring from active seafaring and spending more time with his growing family. The first mate of the Pacific Star was David Rothschild, 31 years old. Rothschild had been at sea since his late teens. He had worked on various fishing vessels and merchant ships. He was working to accumulate the experience and qualifications necessary to eventually obtain his own captain's license. He was married with 2 young children. His wife worked as a teacher in Tauranga. The chief engineer was Martin Kowalski, 48 years old. Kowalski had been born in Poland and had immigrated to New Zealand in the 1950s. He had extensive experience with marine diesel engines. He was meticulous about maintaining the engines of the Pacific Star. He was known for his dedication to keeping the ship's mechanical systems in good working order. The radio operator was a young man named David Chen, 26 years old. Chen was of Chinese descent and had grown up in New Zealand. He was engaged to be married. His wedding was scheduled for December 1967, approximately 3 weeks after the voyage of the Pacific Star was supposed to conclude. Chen was excited about his upcoming marriage. He had been saving money for a home down payment and was planning to start a family with his fiancée, a woman named Susan. The cook was James Murphy, 38 years old. Murphy had worked as a cook on various fishing vessels for 15 years. He was a skilled cook who took pride in feeding the crew well. He was known for his ability to prepare nutritious and tasty meals from basic ingredients. He had a wife and 3 children in Tauranga. The deckhands were 3 younger men: Thomas Wilson, 24 years old, Robert Patterson, 27 years old, and Michael Brennan, 23 years old. Wilson, Patterson, and Brennan were working-class men from families with limited economic means. They worked as deckhands because the pay was relatively good, and because there were limited other employment opportunities available to them in Tauranga in 1967. They were inexperienced compared to the older crew members, but they were healthy and strong and willing to work. These were the 8 men who departed from Tauranga on November 15, 1967, aboard the Pacific Star. They were not wealthy men. They were not particularly famous or celebrated. They were ordinary working men who had chosen a difficult profession because it was available to them and because it offered them a livelihood. On November 15, 1967, the Pacific Star was prepared for departure from the port of Tauranga. The vessel was loaded with fresh supplies, including food for the planned week-long voyage. The fuel tanks were filled, the nets were checked and prepared. The ship's systems were inspected and verified to be in working order. Captain Mackenzie reported to the harbor master that he intended to conduct fishing operations in the waters of the Bay of Plenty, approximately 40 to 60 nautical miles offshore. He reported that he expected the voyage to last approximately 5 to 7 days. He indicated that he would maintain regular radio contact with shore and would report his location and condition periodically. The weather forecast for the period of November 15th through November 22nd indicated generally stable conditions. There was a possibility of some wind and rough seas on November 17th, but nothing that would be considered unusual or particularly dangerous for a fishing vessel. The weather forecast suggested conditions that would be normal for the Bay of Plenty in mid-November. At approximately 7:00 a.m. on November 15th, the Pacific Star departed from Tauranga Harbor. The vessel moved slowly out of the harbor, following the established shipping lanes. Once the ship reached open water, Captain Mackenzie ordered the engines to increase speed. The vessel set course for the fishing grounds. The departure was observed by various people. Harbor workers saw the ship leave. Other ships in the harbor saw the Pacific Star depart. There was nothing unusual about the departure. It was a routine fishing vessel beginning what was expected to be a routine voyage. For the first day and a half of the voyage, the Pacific Star operated normally. Radio communications were maintained with shore. Other vessels in the area received routine weather and position reports from the Pacific Star. The crew worked on the fishing nets and prepared equipment for the fishing operations that would begin once the ship reached the fishing grounds. On the morning of November 18, 1967, at approximately 0600 hours, 6 a.m., Captain James Mackenzie made his final log entry. This entry was recorded in the ship's official logbook, a document that would later be recovered and examined by maritime investigators. The entry read, "So 600 hours. Position approximately 40 nautical miles northeast of Tauranga. Weather clear. Sea state moderate. Nets deployed. Operating normally. All crew members on duty. Captain James Mackenzie." This entry established that at 600 hours on November 18th, Captain Mackenzie was present on the vessel and was maintaining normal operations. The entry indicated that the weather was clear, that the seas were moderate, and that the ship was operating according to plan. The entry indicated that all crew members were present and were on duty. What happened between 600 hours and approximately 1200 hours, noon, on November 18th, remains unknown. During this 6-hour period, something occurred that caused the entire crew of 8 men to abandon the Pacific Star. On November 18th, 1967, at approximately 1000 hours, 10 a.m., a merchant vessel named the Baltic Runner was making its way across the Bay of Plenty. The Baltic Runner was a commercial cargo vessel, approximately 90 meters in length, carrying general cargo and supplies. The Baltic Runner was traveling from Auckland to the port at Rotorua, a journey of approximately 200 nautical miles that typically took 18 to 20 hours at the cruising speed of the vessel. The Baltic Runner's crew consisted of approximately 25 people, including the captain, the first mate, the chief engineer, radio operators, deckhands, and stewards. The crew was professional and experienced in commercial maritime operations. On the morning of November 18th, the weather in the Bay of Plenty was clear, visibility was good, and sea conditions were moderate to calm. The Baltic Runner's captain, a man named Gerald Thompson, was on the bridge overseeing operations. The ship's course was established, and the crew was going about the ordinary business of ocean navigation. At approximately 10:15 hours, one of the Baltic Runner's deck officers spotted something unusual on the horizon. A ship. The officer reported the sighting to Captain Thompson. Thompson directed the Baltic Runner's course slightly to allow for a closer inspection of the vessel. As the Baltic Runner approached the other vessel, the crew began to identify specific details. This was a fishing vessel. She had the characteristic shape and structure of a fishing boat. She appeared to be relatively modern and in good condition. But there was something wrong. The vessel appeared to be unattended. There were no visible signs of crew. No one appeared on deck. No signal flags were flying. No signal was being given from the wheelhouse. The Baltic Runner's captain, Gerald Thompson, was an experienced maritime professional. He recognized that something unusual was occurring. Thompson made the decision to investigate. Thompson directed the Baltic Runner's first mate, a man named Robert Collins, to organize a boarding party. Collins assembled 4 crew members, and they prepared a small boat. The boarding party was equipped with safety equipment and life preservers. The small boat was launched from the Baltic Runner and moved toward the drifting vessel. As the boarding party approached the drifting vessel, they could see that the ship was indeed a fishing vessel. The registration markings on the hull were visible. Pacific Star, registered in New Zealand. The vessel was approximately 65 meters in length, as evidenced by the boarding party's visual assessment. The boarding party pulled their small boat alongside the Pacific Star and secured lines to the vessel. Several members of the boarding party climbed aboard the Pacific Star. What the boarding party discovered on board the Pacific Star was profoundly unsettling. The vessel was completely abandoned. There was no one on deck. The wheelhouse was empty. The crew quarters were empty. The entire ship seemed to be devoid of human presence. Robert Collins, the first mate of the Baltic Runner and the leader of the boarding party, moved systematically through the vessel, attempting to locate anyone who might be on board. He called out. He checked every cabin. He checked the engine room. He checked the galley, and all other spaces where a person might be, but there was no one. The ship was completely empty. Collins then began to examine the condition of the vessel. He noted that the ship appeared to be in good mechanical condition. He noted that the nets were still deployed, suggesting that the ship had been in the process of conducting fishing operations. He noted that various pieces of equipment were in place and appeared to be operational. In the engine room, Collins and his team discovered something significant. There was evidence that the engines had been recently operated. The diesel fuel was still warm. The engine room was warm. There was evidence that the engines had been shut down relatively recently, within the past few hours. Collins then moved to the wheelhouse and the ship's bridge area. In the wheelhouse, Collins discovered a chart table with navigation charts and plotting equipment. The charts showed the ship's course and position, with marks indicating the ship's location at various times. The most recent mark appeared to have been made at approximately 0600 hours on November 18th. On the officer's table in the wheelhouse, Collins discovered the ship's logbook. He opened the logbook and examined the entries. The most recent entry was dated November 18th, 1967, and read, 0600 hours, weather clear, nets deployed, operating normally, Captain Mackenzie. That entry had been made approximately 6 to 9 hours before the Baltic Runner discovered the drifting vessel. So at 0600 hours on November 18th, Captain Mackenzie had been present on the ship, making his routine log entry. But now, at approximately 10:30 hours on November 18th, He was gone. Collins then moved to the galley, the ship's kitchen and dining area. What he found there was profoundly disturbing and highly significant. There were dishes on the table. There was food on plates. There were cups on the table. In one of the cups, there appeared to be coffee. When Collins felt the cup, the coffee was still warm. This was clear evidence that the crew had been in the process of taking a meal, and had then abandoned the vessel suddenly and without warning. The warm coffee indicated that the crew had left their breakfast or mid-morning meal only recently, within the last few hours. Collins continued his inspection. He found clothing in the crew quarters. He found personal possessions, photographs, letters, personal items that crew members had brought with them on the voyage. Everything suggested that the crew had left their possessions behind. In the radio operator's quarters, Collins found a letter that appeared to be partially written. The letter was addressed to someone. The name was incomplete, and began with standard personal correspondence language, but trailed off mid-sentence. The letter appeared to have been abandoned in the process of writing, suggesting that the person writing the letter had been suddenly interrupted. As Collins and his boarding party examined the Pacific Star more thoroughly, they began to realize that they were confronted with a situation that defied easy explanation. The ship showed no signs of catastrophic mechanical failure. The ship showed no signs of violent disturbance or struggle. The ship appeared to be in essentially normal operating condition. There was no evidence of fire, explosion, or any kind of structural failure, and yet the entire crew had disappeared. The boarding party inspected the ship's safety equipment. The lifeboat davits, the mechanical systems that lower lifeboats into the water, were not deployed. The lifeboats were secured in their normal position. The lifeboats had not been launched. The life jackets and life rafts were still on board, apparently unused. This created a profound puzzle. If the crew had abandoned the vessel deliberately, using the lifeboats or life rafts, there would have been evidence of this. The lifeboat davits would have been operated. The lifeboats would have been lowered. The life rafts would have been deployed. But none of this had occurred. If the crew had gone into the water without safety equipment, they would likely not have survived for any extended period, particularly in November, when the temperature of the water in the Bay of Plenty was cold. But there was no evidence that any of the crew had gone into the water. There were no bodies visible in the water. There were no life jackets or life rafts floating in the area. There was no evidence of any of the crew members in the water or having attempted to enter the water. Collins radioed the Baltic Runner with a report of his findings. Captain Thompson of the Baltic Runner immediately contacted the New Zealand Maritime Authority by radio and reported the discovery of an abandoned vessel with no crew present. The New Zealand Maritime Authority responded to the report with concern and urgency. A ship had been found abandoned. A crew of 8 men was missing. The circumstances suggested that something unusual had occurred. The Maritime Authority made several immediate decisions. First, they arranged for the Pacific Star to be taken in tow by a rescue vessel and brought back to port. The goal was to bring the abandoned ship to port so that a thorough investigation could be conducted. Second, they organized a comprehensive search and rescue operation in the area where the Pacific Star had been found. The hope was that perhaps some of the crew had abandoned the vessel in some fashion and might still be alive or recoverable. Third, they contacted the families of the 8 crew members to inform them that their loved one's vessel had been found abandoned and that the crew members were missing. This contact was made with sensitivity, but the basic facts were clear. The Pacific Star had been found abandoned in the Bay of Plenty, and the whereabouts of the 8 crew members were unknown. The search and rescue operation covered an extensive area of the Bay of Plenty, estimated at several hundred square kilometers of ocean. Rescue vessels moved through the waters, searching for any sign of lifeboats, life rafts, or bodies. Aircraft were deployed to conduct aerial searches. Volunteers and professional rescue workers combed the area looking for any evidence of the missing crew members. The search team was particularly focused on looking for bodies, given the reality that if the crew members had gone into the water without adequate safety equipment or without lifeboats, they would almost certainly not have survived for any extended period. The cold water temperature of the Bay of Plenty in November, combined with the physical demands of survival in open water, meant that survival time for a person in the water would be measured in hours rather than days. But the search found nothing. No lifeboats were discovered. No life rafts were found. No bodies were recovered. No evidence of any crew members in the water was discovered. The sea seemed to have completely swallowed the 8 crew members, without leaving a trace. The New Zealand Maritime Authority established a formal maritime inquiry into the disappearance of the Pacific Star's crew. The inquiry was conducted over several months. Evidence was collected. Witnesses were interviewed. Expert testimony was presented. The inquiry examined all available evidence regarding the condition of the ship. The inquiry examined the ship's maintenance records. The inquiry examined the ship's mechanical systems to determine whether any failure might have occurred. The inquiry examined the ship's safety equipment. The inquiry interviewed Captain Gerald Thompson of the Baltic Runner and the crew members who had boarded the Pacific Star. They provided testimony about what they had observed when they discovered the ship. They described the condition of the ship, the presence of warm coffee in the galley, the warm diesel fuel in the engine room, the personal possessions left on board. The inquiry interviewed the harbor master in Tauranga, who testified about the departure of the Pacific Star and the captain's report regarding the intended voyage. The inquiry interviewed various maritime experts who were consulted to provide professional opinions about what might have caused the crew to abandon the vessel. After several months of investigation and inquiry, the Maritime Authority issued its official findings. The findings consisted of a detailed report examining all available evidence. But the crucial conclusion of the report was, the fate of the Pacific Star's crew and the circumstances of the vessel's abandonment remain inconclusive on the evidence available. The official inquiry had determined that the Pacific Star was a seaworthy vessel in good mechanical condition at the time of departure and at the time of discovery. There was no evidence of mechanical failure or structural damage that would have necessitated abandonment. There was no evidence of violent disturbance, struggle, mutiny, or criminal activity aboard the vessel. There was no evidence of fire, explosion, or any kind of catastrophic failure. The crew's personal possessions remained on board, suggesting a sudden, rather than deliberate or planned evacuation. The lifeboats and life rafts were unused and remained on board. No distress signal had been sent from the vessel. No bodies or remains of any crew members were ever recovered. The crew appeared to have been in the process of consuming a meal when they abandoned the vessel, based on the evidence of warm coffee and food on tables. The engines had been recently operated and then shut down, suggesting a controlled shutdown rather than an emergency situation. Based on these findings, the inquiry could not definitively determine what had caused the crew to abandon the Pacific Star. The inquiry could not establish whether the crew had made a deliberate decision to abandon the vessel, or whether they had been forced to do so by circumstances. The inquiry could not determine what became of the crew members after they left the vessel. In the years and decades following the official inquiry, various theories emerged attempting to explain the disappearance of the Pacific Star's crew. These theories ranged from the conventional and scientifically plausible to the extraordinary and speculative. Theory 1. Sudden illness or medical emergency. One theory suggested that the crew had been affected by a sudden and severe illness that had caused them to lose mental clarity or physical capability. The theory suggested that perhaps an outbreak of food poisoning or some other illness had incapacitated the crew, causing them to lose the ability to maintain the ship or to make rational decisions. But this theory struggled to explain several aspects of the case. First, food poisoning typically takes several hours to develop symptoms, and if the crew had been affected by food poisoning in the early morning hours of November 18th, they would likely have been recovering by late morning rather than abandoning the ship. Second, if the crew had been severely ill and incapacitated, they would likely not have had the physical capability to abandon the ship in an organized manner. Third, no bodies or remains were ever found, and a severely ill crew might be expected to remain on the vessel or in lifeboats rather than disappearing completely. Theory 2. Psychological crisis or mass hallucination. Another theory suggested that the crew had been affected by some kind of mass psychological crisis or shared hallucination. The theory suggested that perhaps exposure to some kind of environmental toxin or chemical had affected the crew's mental state, causing them to lose coherent judgment and to abandon the vessel for reasons that made sense to them in their altered mental state, but that would not make sense to anyone else. This theory was based partly on historical precedent. There had been documented cases of crews being affected by unusual atmospheric conditions or exposure to strange substances that had caused unusual behavior. But there was no evidence of any toxic substance on board the Pacific Star. There was no evidence of any unusual atmospheric condition. The theory remained speculative. Theory 3. Unexpected severe weather. A third theory suggested that the crew had encountered a waterspout, a sudden and violent storm, or some other severe weather phenomenon that had caused them to abandon ship, even though the weather conditions on November 18, 1967, were reported to be relatively calm in the Bay of Plenty. The theory suggested that perhaps a localized severe weather event had occurred that was not recorded in the official weather reports. Perhaps a waterspout had formed suddenly and unexpectedly. Perhaps winds had increased dramatically over a short period of time. Perhaps waves had become dangerously high, but witnesses aboard other vessels in the area had not reported any severe weather event. The Baltic Runner, which was in the vicinity of the Pacific Star when it was discovered, reported clear weather and calm to moderate seas. The official weather reports for the period indicated stable conditions. The theory that a sudden severe weather event had occurred remained unsupported by evidence. Theory 4. Equipment malfunction, creating false perception of danger. A fourth theory suggested that the crew had experienced some kind of equipment malfunction that had created the perception of danger, even though no actual danger was present. The theory suggested that perhaps the radio had malfunctioned and had produced alarming messages that the crew had interpreted as warnings or distress calls. Perhaps the radar had malfunctioned and had shown false contacts that the crew had interpreted as ships or other threats. The theory suggested that the crew, believing the ship to be in danger based on these false perceptions, had made the decision to abandon the vessel. But this theory struggled to explain why experienced sailors would make such a decision without first investigating the situation thoroughly. The theory also struggled to explain why the crew would have abandoned the ship without using the lifeboats or life rafts. Theory 5. Deliberate suicide or abandonment. A fifth theory suggested that the crew had deliberately abandoned the vessel as part of some kind of planned scheme. The theory suggested that perhaps the vessel had been deliberately abandoned for insurance purposes. The theory suggested that perhaps the crew had made a deliberate decision to abandon the vessel and to disappear. But this theory struggled to explain the lack of evidence supporting such a deliberate plan. There was no evidence that the crew members had communicated about such a plan. There was no evidence of any financial motive. The theory also struggled to explain what had become of the crew members if they had deliberately abandoned the vessel. Theory 6. External threat or military incident. A sixth theory, which emerged later and was driven by discussions about the case in various maritime and intelligence circles, suggested that the crew had encountered an unidentified submarine, an unidentified military vessel, or some kind of hostile force, and that they had been captured, killed, or forced to abandon the vessel as part of a military or intelligence operation. This theory was based on the assumption that Cold War-era geopolitical tensions might have motivated such an action. The theory suggested that perhaps the Pacific Star had been involved in some kind of espionage or intelligence-gathering activity. The theory suggested that perhaps a foreign military force had deliberately attacked or captured the vessel, but there was no evidence supporting this theory. No military operation was ever acknowledged. No intelligence agency ever claimed involvement. The theory remained entirely speculative and based on Cold War-era anxieties, rather than on concrete evidence. Theory 7. Inexplicable maritime phenomenon. A seventh theory, advanced by some who were skeptical of conventional explanations, suggested that the crew had been affected by some kind of inexplicable phenomenon associated with the sea itself. The theory suggested that the Bay of Plenty might be a location where unusual maritime events occurred. The theory suggested that perhaps the crew had been affected by electromagnetic anomalies, unusual gravitational phenomena, or some other force that left no physical evidence. This theory was entirely speculative and was not supported by any evidence, but it reflected the human tendency to invoke extraordinary explanations when conventional explanations seem inadequate. For the families of the 8 crew members, the disappearance of the Pacific Star was not primarily a maritime mystery to be solved. It was a profound personal tragedy. 8 men had gone to sea and had not returned. 8 families had lost husbands, fathers, brothers, sons. The families faced a peculiar form of grief. The disappearance of a loved one without recovery of the body creates a unique psychological challenge. There is no grave to visit. There is no body to bury. There is no concrete object on which to focus mourning rituals. The absence is both absolute and somehow incomplete. Captain James Mackenzie had been married for 30 years. He had 4 adult children and 7 grandchildren. His wife Margaret received a death certificate issued by the Maritime Authority based on the presumption that her husband had died, even though no body had ever been recovered. Margaret spent the remainder of her life. She lived until 1995. At the age of 85, wondering what had happened to her husband in those final moments before he disappeared. Margaret became obsessed with the case. She corresponded with maritime experts. She attended every hearing and public inquiry related to the case. She spoke to journalists and researchers. She maintained detailed files of all information related to the disappearance. But despite her efforts, she never received a satisfactory explanation for what had happened to her husband. She died without ever knowing the truth about what became of Captain James Mackenzie. Margaret had written to her daughter, Sarah, in 1980, 13 years after the disappearance. "I cannot stop thinking about his last moments. Was he afraid? Did he understand what was happening? Did he think of us? These questions haunt me every day. I have created a version of events in my mind, a narrative that explains what happened. But I know that this narrative is only my imagination. The truth remains hidden in the sea, and I will never know it." The other crew members had similar stories. They had families who mourned them. They had dependents who lost their financial support. They had people who loved them and who spent years attempting to understand what had happened. David Chen, the radio operator, had been engaged to be married. His fiancée, Susan, received news of his disappearance just weeks before the planned wedding. The wedding had been planned for December 1967. David had been looking forward to it with great anticipation. He had purchased a house with his savings. He had made plans for the future with Susan. When David disappeared, Susan was devastated. She received a death certificate. The insurance company eventually paid out David's life insurance to his parents, since he had designated them as his beneficiaries. Susan received nothing. She had no legal claim on David's possessions or his insurance. She had to move forward with her life without her intended husband. Susan eventually married someone else, but she always wondered what had happened to David. She never completely moved on from the trauma of his disappearance. In 1997, approximately 30 years after David's disappearance, Susan was interviewed by a researcher examining the case. When asked about David, she said, "Every day for 30 years, I have thought about him. I wonder what he was doing when the end came. I wonder if he was thinking of me. I wonder what our life together would have been like. These wonderings never stop." Michael Brennan, one of the deckhands, had been the youngest crew member at age 23. His parents received news of their son's disappearance. They had 2 other adult children, but losing Michael was devastating to them. Michael's mother, Grace Brennan, spent the remainder of her life attempting to understand what had happened to her son. Grace maintained a small memorial in her home. She kept photographs of Michael. She kept newspaper clippings about the Pacific Star. She kept correspondence related to the investigation. Every year on November 18th, the anniversary of Michael's disappearance, Grace would light a candle and spend time remembering her son. Grace lived until 2003. In a letter written to her granddaughter just before her death, Grace wrote, "I have never stopped hoping that somehow Michael survived. I know this hope is unrealistic. I know that the probability of him surviving 60 years without making contact is essentially 0, but a mother's hope does not follow the logic of probability. I have always harbored a secret belief that somehow Michael is alive, somewhere, and that one day he might contact us. This belief has brought me comfort, even as I have known that it is likely a delusion." The disappearance of the Pacific Star's crew was not unprecedented in maritime history. Maritime history contains numerous cases of ships being found abandoned with no crew on board and no clear explanation for why the crew had abandoned the vessel. The most famous and most studied example is the Mary Celeste, a merchant vessel that was found abandoned in 1872 in the North Atlantic. The Mary Celeste was a seaworthy vessel in good condition. The crew's personal possessions were still on board. The ship's cargo was still on board. The lifeboats were secured on the ship, but the crew had completely disappeared. The Mary Celeste's case became legendary, particularly after publication of a heavily fictionalized account that invented details that were not supported by historical evidence. The true story of the Mary Celeste remains unsolved to this day, nearly 150 years after its discovery. Various theories have been proposed to explain the disappearance, but no definitive explanation has ever been established. Another famous case involved the Joyita, a vessel that was found abandoned in 1955 in the South Pacific. The Joyita had been damaged, and there was evidence of hasty evacuation, but the crew's fate remained unclear. Some crew members were rescued, but the captain and several others disappeared. Various other cases existed as well. The Waratah disappeared in 1909 with all crew and passengers. The Carol A. Deering was found abandoned in 1921. The Prince Frederick was found abandoned in 1929. The Helvetia was found abandoned in 1939. Throughout maritime history, cases of abandoned ships and missing crews have occurred repeatedly. These historical precedents suggested that such disappearances, while unusual, were not unprecedented. The sea, it seemed, sometimes swallowed ships' crews without leaving a clear record of what had happened. But the disappearance of the Pacific Star occurred in the modern era, in 1967. It occurred in waters off a developed country with sophisticated maritime communication systems. It occurred in an era when ships routinely communicated with shore, when rescue operations were well coordinated, when maritime disasters were typically well documented. In this context, the complete disappearance of a ship's crew seemed even more extraordinary and more difficult to explain. As decades passed following the disappearance of the Pacific Star's crew, the case gradually faded from public consciousness. The initial intense media interest in the case waned. Newspaper articles about the case became fewer. Television documentaries were made and then were aired and then moved on to other cases. The official file on the case remained open in the New Zealand Maritime Authority's archives, but no active investigation was being conducted. New evidence was not emerging. New leads were not materializing. The case simply remained in a state of permanent unresolution. In the 1980s, a journalist and maritime historian named Robert Hartford became interested in the case and began to conduct his own informal investigation. Hartford was fascinated by maritime mysteries and had spent several years researching various cases of unusual maritime disappearances. Hartford interviewed surviving family members of the crew members. He traveled to Tauranga and conducted interviews with local residents who had known the crew members or who had been involved in the search and recovery efforts. He reviewed all available documents and records related to the case that were held in the Maritime Authority's archives. Hartford's investigation produced no definitive answers. The mystery remained as impenetrable as it had been in 1967, but Hartford did uncover some additional details and some additional perspective that had not been previously published. Hartford learned, for instance, that some members of the crew had expressed concerns about the seaworthiness of the Pacific Star in the weeks before the voyage. One crew member had mentioned to a friend that the ship seemed to have some mechanical issues, but these concerns had not been significant enough to prevent the voyage from occurring. Hartford also learned that Captain Mackenzie had been considering retiring after this voyage. He had mentioned to his wife that he was tired of going to sea and that he was thinking of taking a shore-based position with the fishing company. This detail suggested that Mackenzie would not have deliberately abandoned the ship, as he had been looking forward to a new phase of his career. Hartford published an article about the case in a maritime history journal in 1988. The article brought the case to the attention of a new audience of maritime historians and enthusiasts. The article also prompted some additional correspondence from people who had knowledge of or interest in the case. In the 2000s, the case was examined by maritime experts and psychologists who were interested in unusual cases of mass behavior and mass disappearances. These experts attempted to apply modern psychological understanding to the historical case, attempting to determine what might have caused 8 experienced sailors to abandon a seaworthy vessel. One such expert, a psychologist named Dr. Eleanor Stratford, published a paper in 2005 examining the case. Stratford's paper suggested that the crew might have been affected by some kind of shared psychological episode, perhaps triggered by misinterpretation of some kind of equipment malfunction or unusual circumstance. Stratford's paper proposed that the crew might have convinced each other that the ship was in danger, even though no objective danger existed. But Stratford's paper acknowledged that her theory was speculative and was not supported by definitive evidence. The paper concluded, "The case of the Pacific Star remains fundamentally mysterious. While psychological theory might suggest possible explanations for the crew's behavior, no explanation can be confirmed based on the available evidence." Over time, the story of the Pacific Star and its missing crew took on the character of a legend. The ship was sometimes referred to as a ghost ship, a vessel that had been found abandoned with its crew, vanished without a trace. The story became part of maritime folklore. The story was told and retold in maritime circles, in fishing communities, and among people interested in maritime mysteries. Some versions of the story suggested that the crew members had been affected by some kind of supernatural or paranormal phenomenon. Some versions suggested that the ship had been targeted by some kind of hostile force. Some versions suggested that the crew members had been transported or abducted by something that left no physical evidence behind. These embellished versions of the story were not supported by evidence, but they reflected the human tendency to find narrative logic and explanation in situations that resist conventional explanation. The true story was so extraordinary that it seemed to invite extraordinary explanations, even though extraordinary explanations were not supported by evidence. The story of the Pacific Star became one of the most famous maritime mysteries in New Zealand history. It was included in guidebooks about maritime mysteries. It was discussed on internet forums dedicated to unexplained disappearances. It was referenced in popular culture. But with each retelling, more details were added or modified. Facts became blurred with speculation. The line between what was actually known and what was speculated became increasingly unclear. The legend that developed around the Pacific Star diverged increasingly from the historical truth. The legend emphasized the mysteriously abandoned ship. The legend emphasized the unexplained disappearance. The legend emphasized the sense of the unknown and the unknowable. But the historical truth was more nuanced and more human than the legend. The historical truth involved 8 specific individuals with families, hopes, and dreams. The historical truth involved a ship that was seaworthy, but was being operated in an environment where unusual circumstances can occur, and where the margin between safety and disaster can be narrow. The historical truth did not provide a satisfying narrative. The historical truth did not provide closure or explanation. The historical truth simply presented a profound absence, an unanswered question, a mystery that remained despite investigation. The families of the crew members lived with this ambiguity. They had to accept that they would probably never know with certainty what happened to their loved ones. They had to move forward with their lives without the answers that they desperately wanted. In 2025, nearly 60 years after the disappearance, what we know about the fate of the Pacific Star's crew is limited to the basic facts that were established through investigation and maritime inquiry. We know that the Pacific Star was a seaworthy fishing vessel that departed from port on November 15, 1967, with a crew of 8 experienced sailors under the command of Captain James Mackenzie. We know that the ship was operating normally as of 600 hours on November 18, 1967, when Captain Mackenzie made his final log entry. We know that by approximately 1200 hours, noon, on November 18, 1967, the entire crew had abandoned the vessel. We know that the ship was found with warm coffee still in cups in the galley, suggesting that the crew had abandoned their breakfast or mid-morning meal only recently before the ship was discovered. We know that the ship was found with no signs of mechanical failure or structural damage. We know that the ship's safety equipment had not been used. We know that there was no distress signal sent from the ship. We know that the crew left behind their personal possessions and their life-saving equipment. We know that no bodies were ever recovered. We know that no lifeboats or life rafts were ever found. We know that no definitive explanation for the crew's disappearance was ever established. We know that the official maritime inquiry concluded that the circumstances of the abandonment remained inconclusive on the evidence available. What we don't know is everything beyond these basics. Facts. We don't know what motivated the crew to abandon the ship. We don't know where they went after they left the ship. We don't know whether they went into the water voluntarily or were forced to do so. We don't know whether they survived for any period of time after leaving the ship, or whether they died immediately. We don't know what their final thoughts were, or what they understood about their situation. These unknowns have remained unknowns for 60 years. The mystery has persisted despite investigation, despite speculation, despite the passage of time and the advancement of investigative technology. The case of the Pacific Star and its missing crew represents a particular kind of unsolved mystery. It is not a mystery that involves a clear crime with an unclear perpetrator. It is not a mystery that involves a known victim with an unknown cause of death. It is a mystery that involves a complete absence of bodies and a complete absence of clear explanation for a series of events. The disappearance of the Pacific Star's crew challenges our ability to construct logical narratives about what happened. It suggests that there are circumstances in which events can occur that leave no clear record, no clear evidence, no clear path to understanding. In this respect, the case of the Pacific Star is emblematic of the sea itself. The sea is a place where distance and isolation create conditions in which mysteries can persist. The sea is a place where evidence can be destroyed or lost. The sea is a place where human activity can be hidden or obscured. The sea is also a place where humans have learned to operate, but where the margin between survival and disaster remains thin. The sea is an environment that demands respect and preparation and attention. But the sea is also an environment where unexpected circumstances can arise, where danger can appear suddenly, where the unexpected can occur. The 8 crew members of the Pacific Star remain missing. Their fate remains unknown. Their families remain without closure. The mystery remains. And somewhere in the waters of the Bay of Plenty, the sea continues to keep its secrets. Nearly 60 years after the disappearance, certain questions continue to haunt those who are interested in the case. Why would experienced sailors abandon a seaworthy vessel without using safety equipment or sending a distress signal? This question remains at the core of the case and remains fundamentally unanswered. What caused the crew to abandon the ship? Was it a perceived emergency that was not actually an emergency? Was it a deliberate decision based on information or circumstances that we do not know about? Was it something that the crew was forced to do against their will? Where did the crew members go after they left the ship? Did they attempt to enter the water? Did they board lifeboats that were somehow removed from the scene? Did they board another vessel that had approached the Pacific Star? Did the crew members survive for any period of time after leaving the Pacific Star? Were they rescued by another vessel? Were they killed as part of some unknown incident? Why were no bodies ever recovered? The Bay of Plenty is an area where bodies of drowned persons have historically been recovered. Why were there no bodies in this case? These questions remain unanswered. They may never be answered. The mystery of the Pacific Star may be one of those maritime mysteries that persists indefinitely, remaining unsolved until the memories of all those who knew the crew members fade away, and the case becomes only a footnote in maritime history. Despite remaining unsolved, the case of the Pacific Star had certain impact on maritime practices and on our understanding of maritime safety. The case demonstrated the importance of maintaining regular communication from vessels at sea. The case demonstrated the importance of understanding what constitutes an emergency and what does not. The case also became part of maritime folklore and popular culture. It was referenced in various documentaries and popular media. It became one of the most famous maritime mysteries in New Zealand history, but perhaps most importantly, the case served as a reminder of the enduring mystery of the sea. The case demonstrated that in the modern era, with all of our technology and communication systems, the sea could still swallow a ship and its crew without explanation, without warning, without leaving a clear record. The families of the 8 crew members moved forward with their lives. They raised children and grandchildren who knew their fathers and grandfathers only through stories and photographs. They maintained memories of the men who had disappeared in 1967, and the sea continued to keep its secrets.